Hello everybody, I'm here to talk to you today about some Excel tips, particularly involving making some basic templates and then summarizing multiple tabs of information into a single area. So some objectives of this video is to start out talking about how to take multiple data files and then combine them into a single spreadsheet, and then move on to how to perform calculations on multiple tabs at one time. Then we'll talk about creating a template for data sets of different sizes, and then we'll wrap up summarizing multiple tabs of information onto a single tab. Now, note before I get started is that I'm using Microsoft Office 365 on Windows 10, and therefore I have certain capabilities that earlier versions might not have, or if, for instance, you're using an Apple computer, a lot of Excel functions do not behave the same way there, and so I'm going to be focused on my particular version, though at least for the Windows versions, most of the capabilities are the same for various Microsoft Office versions back. So we'll start out with combining data files. So if you are dealing with any form of experimentation or taking in large amounts of data, you've probably encountered this situation where you've got many files of data, each with a certain type of information that you're trying to calculate altogether. So here we've got a bunch of FFT data with different sampling rates being used, and we want to summarize this all into a single spreadsheet. So the first step is that we want to bring all this information into a single spreadsheet. So the first way in which you can bring information over into a summarized spreadsheet is to simply copy-paste. Which is fairly simple and can work, although there are better ways to do it. And so in this case, you just press Control-Shift and then highlight the regions by pressing the right and down arrow. And then copy, bring it over, and then you can paste that information in. And usually good practice that you want to maintain here is you want to label the tabs with what information is being present. So in this case, this is FFT data for 150 Hertz sampling rate. So once we're done with that data sheet, I'm just going to remove that one. I'm going to get rid of that information and move on to the next spreadsheet. And so another way in which you can do the same thing, again, we're going to label this just by double-clicking on the tab and say 200 Hertz. So another way you can actually do this is you can right-click on that tab and go to Move or Copy, and then you can go to the To Book, which selects which Excel book you're actually going to be operating on, and we want to bring this into the sample rate results. And then once we've done this, we can change where in that spreadsheet it's going to show up. In this case, I want to go in ascending order, so I'm going to move the 200 Hertz below the 150, and then click OK, and you can see it transfers it over. Another way that is a little bit easier to do is to simply drag the tab over. And so you can actually click on that tab and then bring it over here. And so now I'm going to quickly repeat this process and skip the details in between. Now I've got most of this data here now, and I'm going to save this last data sheet for an exercise that I'm going to do a little bit later. So now we've managed to bring all these data files into a single spreadsheet. Now we want to do some calculations on the information that we've received. So a quick navigational tactic that we can use is if you just press Control and then page up and down, you can shift left and right along the tabs here. So I'm just going to start off at the 150 Hertz signal. So there are a few things that we're going to want to gather here. The first thing that you're going to want to do is gather the measured amplitude, and that is the amplitude value where the amplitude peaks. And then F measured, which will be the frequency at which that peak amplitude occurs at, the maximum frequency of the FFT, and then the step change in between one frequency value and the next. And I'll add units. Now to start out with our calculation for the amplitude, this is a simple function. It's just taking the maximum of all the amplitudes and press Control Shift down, close the parentheses, and then press enter. So for this F measured calculation, I'm going to type out what it is and then I'll explain what I just did. Alright, so this function basically runs an if statement where if E1, which is that A measure that we just calculated, matches some component of this array for amplitude, then we want to return the corresponding frequency value at the same row. If it does not equal this A measured value, then we want to return 0. And so this will create an array of values where everything will be 0 except for the one frequency that we want. And this frequency is going to be a positive value, so if I just set a max function around this if statement and then press Control Shift Enter, it will calculate that the F measured value occurs at 50 Hertz for the 1.52 volt signal. For F max, again, it's just a maximum function. And then DF is the increment between the frequencies, which in this case would be just this value A3 because the one below is, or the one before this is just 0, and so it's a simple subtraction. These are the basic equations that I'm going to calculate, and I want to replicate this for each of the individual tabs. Now you can imagine that while the calculations themselves aren't very difficult, trying to replicate this for numerous tabs can be exhausting. And so there are actually better ways in which we can do this, and I'm going to show you right now. So I'm going to move over to the 200 Hertz signal and replicate this same set of functions, but for all the remaining tabs. Alright, so in order to replicate the functions onto each of the tabs, what you can do is you can actually press Control Shift and then page down. And as you continue to press page down, you will select an increasing number of tabs until you get to the end. And what happens when you select multiple tabs is any function that you perform on here will be done on each of the tabs simultaneously. Now there are some limitations to this. For instance, if you're using tables, it doesn't like to do that on multiple tabs at once since you're making different references. But if you're doing it as I'm doing it here where you don't have any tables present, it usually works pretty well. So we'll plug in the variables we want to calculate and then run the same calculations. Alright, now that I've performed these calculations, we can check through each of the tabs to see that they are in fact updated. And as we scroll along through these tabs, we see that each one has a different value. And if we were to check one of these, let's say the 300 at 2.2, we scroll down to roughly 300. So 300.09 does in fact happen with a 2.2 voltage. And we notice that the DF is correct as 0.68, and then if we go down to the very end, the maximum value is in fact 350. Alright, so what I just showed you is how to perform multiple calculations on different tabs all at one time. However, there's an issue with this because sometimes the data sets that you've got have different sizes. And so if, for instance, your data set involved twice as many rows of data, then this calculation wouldn't work because you're not highlighting the same range of cells. Now, in order to work with this, you can create a template that can adjust its size. Alright, so I'm going to do this on the 20,000 Hertz tab, and once I make this into a template, I'm going to duplicate that and then copy paste the 32,000 Hertz signal from over here into the new templated tab that we will create. So the first thing that we want to do here is we want to turn this information that we've got into a table. So if you press Control T and press OK, this will turn into a table, which doesn't look very fancy. However, there are some nice benefits that come out of this. And the first thing that you can do here is go into these functions, and if you hover over the top row of the heading, it will now change this reference into the table that you're using, and then all of the amplitude values. And so if I press enter, now it does the same calculation, but now it's going, no matter what, from the first row of your data down to the last row. And that is independent of the size of the table. It'll always go from the first one to the last one. Now if we repeat this for all of these, we can see that none of the values ended up changing. And that's good. Now, in order to make this into a template, what we can do is actually copy this tab over. And there are multiple ways to do this. The first one that you can do is just right-click on the tab, go to Move or Copy, and then create a copy, move to the end, and click OK. And now we see that it has the same label, but with a parentheses around 2. That means it's a copy, a second copy of the original tab. Now in this case, we're going to call this a template. And what we can do at this point is we can actually remove many of these rows of data. And the reason why I'm going to do this is because we want this template to have a smaller number of rows than the smallest feasible data set that we're going to plug in here. But you want to at least have a couple data points, because if we remove enough that these references disappear, then the calculations themselves disappear. So I'm going to press Control-Shift down, and then Shift right, and then press Control- in order to remove those. The other way you can remove them is just press Delete, but my version allows me to press Control-. And notice that the calculations have updated, but the references are still the same. This means that the cell functions that you're using are still viable. They're just referencing a different range. In this case, the maximum of 0.07 occurs at 0, rather than what it originally was. Now at this point, what I end up doing is I take this template and I will make copies of it and paste in the data that we want to use. That way I can retain that template tab for any future data I might want to plug in. And so the other way in which you can make this copy is actually press Control and then drag the tab over and then let go. And notice that it did the exact same thing as though I did the move or copy. And I'm going to move this back over to the right of the 2000, relabel this as 3200 hertz or 32,000 hertz. Now I'm going to come over here and I'm going to highlight the data region, copy it, and then click on the top left data point cell, and then right click and then paste in the values. Once you do that, you notice that all these values ended up updating to incorporate the calculations on this new data set. And you can replicate this for as many different data sets as you'd like. All right, so now that we've successfully managed to do all the calculations that we want to do, we want to be able to summarize this information into a single tab very quickly. So here we are again on the spreadsheet we just did all our calculations on. And I'm going to move up to the first tab and then press plus to create a new tab. And I'm going to move this over to the left and rename this summary. Now I'm going to make a table that iterates through all of these frequencies, and it's going to ask for the same values that we calculated in each of the tabs. And the first column that I'm going to have is going to be one that just labels the tab that it occurs at. With each of these rows of information, I'm going to resize them by highlighting all of the columns that have something in it, and then go to one of the in-betweens of columns, so this junction here, until I see this symbol appear, and then I double click, which will automatically resize all of them. And I'm going to expand this tab one a little bit just because it's going to have a label. And now I'm going to plug in each of the frequency values. All right, so I actually decided to not include the last one just so that I can show you how this summary tab could update with adding information in. And so I'm going to turn this into a table, same way as before. And now the first thing that I want to do is create a label for the tabs. And a quick way to do this is to set equals select the sampling frequency you want, and then do an and symbol, and then add in hertz at the end. And so this basically concatenates the values in the F sampling column, and then it adds on hertz at the end in order to be the same as the tab names below. And this is actually very important, that you want these to be the same as your tab names. So I click enter, and we can see that it shows up looking identical to what we've got down here. Now, I've seen a lot of different ways in which people do this calculation or do this summarization here. The first thing that people will often do is they'll come over here and they'll just copy the value and then paste the value in as a numeric. And one of the problems with doing it this way is now this doesn't update if you ended up making a mistake in your calculations. And this can be a really big problem if you got a lot of references where you're just pasting the values in. So I strongly discourage doing this. What you can instead do is paste a link. And in order to do that, we'll go back over to 150 hertz, copy. So I'm going to come back over here, and while it doesn't really work with tables, I'm going to show just how link works. So you can go to paste options and then go to paste link. And now we notice that we've got the cell function is equals 150 hertz E1. And so if I were to come back over to 150 hertz and then change this to say 2, and then I come back to the summary tab, now this has been updated. But we don't want to do that right now, so I'm going to undo that work. Now the way that I recommend doing this when we're dealing with a table is a little bit different. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to press equal, move over to the tab that I want, and highlight this A measured value, and press enter. Now the first one's correct, but the rest of them are not. And the reason why is because whenever a table replicates a function, the referenced row follows with the row of the table. And so this third row here is taking the information from the 150 hertz tab, but one row down. And so in this case, this is the F measured, this is the F max, and this is the DF, and then the rest of the cells were blank, and so they return a 0. Now we want this to just be A measured alone and have it iterate through the different tabs. So in order to do this, you can use a function called indirect. I usually put the indirect here, and indirect basically allows you to turn the cell reference into a function in itself. And what I mean by that is I want all of this to stay the same except for this 150 hertz. And so this 150 hertz I'm going to turn into a function of this tab over here. And everything else I'm going to lock in place by using quotation marks. And so this apostrophe here, I'm going to put quotation marks around, and then put an and symbol. I'm going to highlight this and click on the 150 hertz, and now it says tab because that's where it's drawing the information from. I'm going to put another and symbol, quotation marks, close out the quotation marks here, and then close out the parentheses. When I press enter, now we see these values have updated. If we want to check a reference point here, we'll go to 200 hertz and see what the value is. And in fact, it is 3.17, and so we have been successful in replicating this information over. Now, we could do the same process for these other three, but there's a way to automate this even further, and that is to know that each of these values is one row down on the tab you're referencing. And so that would be the equivalent of saying E2, E3, and E4. Now, we can actually make this value 1 change with the column that it's on. And in order to do this, we can close out the parentheses on the E instead of the 1, delete the 1, add an and symbol, and then I'm going to do column minus 2. And the reason why I'm doing the column minus 2, this column function returns the number of the column that you're currently on, which in this case would be 3, since it's A, B, C, or 1, 2, 3. And then I'm just subtracting 2. And what that means is that this would always return a 1, but then the next column will return a 2 because it'll be 4 minus 2, and then so on. So if I press enter, these calculations stay the same, but if I were to copy and paste, now all of these have been updated. And these happen to correspond to the F measured for each of these tabs. I can do the same thing here and here. And now we've just summarized each of these pieces of information very quickly. And now if I were to add more data in, so in this case that 32,000 hertz that I have at the end of this spreadsheet, I can just type in 32,000, press enter, and now all these data values show up automatically. Usually you want this just to look very clean, and so I will actually go to View and then remove the grid lines. And so now it just looks a little bit more of a cleaner interface. Oh, and one other thing that you can do once you've got this information is you can actually use these down arrows, and you can filter out for particular values. So say you wanted to compare the 200 hertz and the 2000 hertz, and you press OK. Now only those ones show up, and you can quickly compare what the value differences are. And thank you for watching. I hope you found this useful, and stay tuned for future videos on more Excel tips.